The storm was coming, not the kind that brought rain, but the kind that brought reckoning. Rachel Morgan stood perfectly still as 200 pairs of eyes fixed on her. The fluorescent lights of Fort Bragg's training facility hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the concrete floor. At 45, she was at least 15 years older than most of the special operations candidates surrounding her. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, nothing about her appearance suggesting she was anything more than what her paperwork claimed: a civilian contractor with limited military experience seeking admission to an elite program. Captain Melissa Carson's voice cut through the silence. Morgan front and center. Rachel stepped forward, her movements precise but unremarkable. She knew what was coming. The inspection was a time-honored tradition in certain training circles, a way to weed out the weak, to break spirits before bodies. But not all traditions deserve to survive. "Since you think you belong here," Carson announced loud enough for everyone to hear, "let's see if you've got what it takes. Strip down for physical inspection." A ripple went through the room. Some faces lit with anticipation, others showed discomfort. This wasn't standard protocol. This was humiliation disguised as assessment. Rachel locked eyes with Carson, measuring the challenge. The captain stood with arms folded across her chest, athletic frame, radiating confidence born from Olympic competition and years of command. At 28, she had ascended quickly through the ranks, earning a reputation for ruthlessness in training and excellence in the field. "Now, Morgan," Carson insisted, her voice carrying the unmistakable edge of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. Rachel began unbuttoning her uniform top with mechanical efficiency. No emotion crossed her face, no hesitation in her movements. Just the practiced motions of someone who had endured far worse than public embarrassment. On a screen above the training floor, digital numbers appeared: 72, a countdown had begun. 3 days earlier, Rachel had arrived at Fort Bragg carrying a worn duffel bag and paperwork that raised more questions than it answered. The processing clerk had studied her documents with growing confusion. "Ma'am, there seems to be something missing here," he said, pointing to sections heavily redacted with black marker. "These credentials don't follow standard format." Rachel's response was quiet but carried unexpected weight. "The documentation is complete. If there are questions about my eligibility, they should be directed to program administration." The young soldier hesitated, then noticed a note attached to her file classification level beyond his clearance. He processed her through without further questions, assigning her to Barrack 6 with 7 other female candidates. The USS Army John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center at Fort Bragg stood as the crucible where America forged its most elite operators. The sprawling complex housed training facilities for everything from languages to survival, from combat medicine to advanced infiltration techniques. American flags snapped in the Carolina breeze, and everywhere the walls bore the insignia of the units that called this place home: Delta Force, Special Forces Rangers. As Rachel walked across the quad toward her assigned barracks, one pair of eyes followed her with unusual interest. Thung Si Robert Fisher stood watching from the doorway of the instructor's building. At 67, Fisher was one of the oldest active personnel on base, a veteran of Desert Storm and operations few people knew existed. His weathered face had seen more war than most of the instructors combined. "Something interesting, Sergeant Major?" asked a passing lieutenant. Fisher didn't take his eyes off Rachel. "New candidate. There's something not right about her." "Too old, not that." Fisher narrowed his eyes. "The way she moves, the way she scans. That's not someone learning the ropes. That's someone who's been downrange." The lieutenant shrugged and continued on his way, but Fisher remained watching until Rachel disappeared into the barracks building. On a screen near his position, the clock read 69. Inside the female barracks, Rachel methodically arranged her few belongings. She could feel the eyes of the other women assessing her, judging her fitness by appearance alone. Captain Carson was the first to approach, having come to inspect the new arrivals. She held Rachel's file, flipping through it with theatrical skepticism. "Morgan," she said, not looking up, "says here you're 45. What's a woman your age doing trying to join special operations training?" Before Rachel could answer, Carson continued, "Let me guess. Midlife crisis. Trying to prove something. Whatever fantasy brought you here, you should know this isn't summer camp." She closed the file with a snap. "This is where we identify those rare individuals worthy of serving in America's most elite units." Rachel maintained a neutral expression. I understand the purpose of the program, Captain. Carson's eyes narrowed at the lack of intimidation. I've washed out 15 men in the first week. Men with Rangers tabs, men with combat deployments. She stepped closer, invading Rachel's personal space. This is a joke, right? Whose daughter are you? I'm just here to complete the program like everyone else, Rachel replied. The captain smiled thinly. We'll see about that. After Carson left, Rachel sat alone on her bunk. When certain no one was watching, she pulled out a small notebook from her boot and began writing in handwriting so small it would be illegible to casual observation. The notebook contained observations about facility security training protocols and personnel assessments, all recorded in a shorthand only she could decipher. Her mind drifted back to 3 weeks earlier to a meeting in a secure conference room at the Pentagon. General William Parker, a 68-year-old veteran of both Iraq campaigns, had summoned her personally. Colonel Morgan, he had said, using her actual rank, we have a problem with our selection process. What kind of problems, sir? Rachel had asked. We're losing good people. Candidates with exceptional potential are being weeded out for the wrong reasons. He pushed a folder across the table. The program has become about who looks the part rather than who can do the job, who fits a certain mold rather than who brings necessary skills. Rachel had examined the file, understanding immediately why she had been chosen. You want an independent assessment from someone who won't be spotted, someone who can evaluate the program from the inside. Parker leaned forward. I need to know what's really happening in this program, not what shows up in official reports. You realize, sir, that if I do this, I'll be subjected to the same treatment as any candidate. Parker's expression had darkened. That's precisely why I need you. You've survived worse. As Rachel finished recording her notes, she tucked the notebook away, careful to ensure it remained undetected. The clock on her mission read 65 hours. The first morning of training began brutally early. At 4:30, Rachel was already awake, her gear-prepared uniform immaculate. When the barracks lights slammed on at 5 and the duty officer's whistle pierced the darkness, the other candidates stumbled groggily from their bunks. Carson strode in moments later, expecting to catch the new arrivals unprepared. Her eyes widened slightly, seeing Rachel standing ready. Morgan, she noted with surprise that quickly morphed to suspicion. Eager to fail, I see. The morning physical training is designed to push limits. A 2-mile run in full gear, followed by an obstacle course that tested strength, agility, and mental fortitude under pressure. Rachel fell into formation with the others, her expression, calm breathing, controlled. When the run began, she settled into a pace that was steady but unremarkable. She positioned herself in the middle of the pack, not struggling at the back, but not showing off at the front either. Her stride was efficient, economical, betraying years of conditioning without drawing attention to the fact. Lieutenant James Miller Carson, second in command, ran alongside Carson at the head of the formation. What's your assessment of the new arrivals? He asked between controlled breaths. Carson's eyes flicked back toward Rachel. Most won't last a week. That older one, Morgan, she's maintaining pace better than expected. She must have been training for months just to get here. Still, there's something off about her file. Off how? Too many redactions, too many unexplained gaps. Carson accelerated slightly, forcing the formation to match her pace. Keep an eye on her. I want to know who she really is. The obstacle course revealed the first glimpses of Rachel's hidden abilities. When she approached the rope climb, Fisher happened to be observing from a nearby tower. While other candidates attacked the rope with brute strength, Rachel employed a technique that maximized leverage while minimizing energy expenditure. Fisher's eyes narrowed in recognition. It wasn't just any climbing technique, it was a specific method taught to Delta operators for urban infiltration. The kind of technique you wouldn't learn at a civilian gym or even in conventional military training. Well, well, he murmured. What have we here? As candidates rested between exercises, Rachel pulled out her notebook and began writing. Carson noticed immediately and approached with predatory focus. What are you writing, Morgan? She demanded. Rachel closed the notebook smoothly. Just observations on the training, Captain, for personal improvement. Carson extended her hand. Let me see it. With respect, these are private notes. Nothing is private during selection, Carson insisted, but before she could press further, the whistle blew for the next exercise. Carson walked away, her eyes lingering on Rachel's pocket where the notebook had disappeared. The clock overhead showed 58:00. That evening in the mess hall, Rachel sat alone, methodically consuming her meal while observing the social dynamics around her. The candidates had already begun forming alliances and hierarchies. Carson entered with her cadre of instructors, and the noise level dipped noticeably. The captain made a point of stopping at Rachel's table. Enjoying the solitude, Morgan, or just no one wants to sit with Grandma? A few nearby candidates snickered. The food is adequate. Rachel replied, neither defensive nor confrontational. Carson wasn't satisfied with the non-reaction. You still haven't answered my question from yesterday. Why is someone your age here? Whose strings did you pull? Rachel looked up, meeting Carson's gaze directly. I'm here to serve in whatever capacity I'm found suitable for, Captain. Same as everyone else. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have for you. Wow. Carson's jaw tightened. We'll see how long that attitude lasts. She leaned closer. I've broken better soldiers than you. After Carson walked away, Rachel remained impassive, but her mind was working. She was cataloging behaviors, identifying patterns, assessing personalities. In her years of operational experience, she had learned that understanding human psychology was often more valuable than any weapon. That night, as the other candidates slept, Rachel allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She stood at the window, looking out across the darkened training grounds. Her mind drifted to Baghdad, 2007. The mission had gone catastrophically wrong. 3 operators down, enemy forces closing in, extraction impossible. She remembered the weight of command, the impossible decisions, the knowledge that every choice meant life or death. She had found a way out when no one else could see it, moving her team through insurgent-controlled territory, using patterns of behavior that made them invisible to those hunting them. No one had expected them to serve them, let alone succeed. But they had, not through superior firepower or physical strength, but through Rachel's ability to think differently, to adapt, to see what others couldn't. The same skills she would need here. As dawn approached on the second day, Rachel noticed Fisher watching her during morning formation. Their eyes met briefly, a moment of silent recognition. Fisher nodded almost imperceptibly, and Rachel knew she had been identified as something other than what she claimed to be. Whether that would help or hinder her mission remained to be seen. The tactical movement exercise that morning revealed more of Rachel's exceptional abilities. Candidates were tasked with navigating through dense woodland while avoiding detection by instructors playing the role of enemy observers. Most candidates approached it like an advanced game of hide-and-seek, using obvious cover and moving in predictable patterns. Rachel moved differently. She used terrain features others overlooked, chose routes that minimized exposure, demonstrated an understanding of sight lines that went far beyond basic training. When she reached the objective, a flag candidates were supposed to retrieve without being spotted, she had been completely undetected. Lieutenant Nathan Cross waited at the extraction point, checking his clipboard with a puzzled expression when Rachel emerged from the tree line. Morgan, he said, consulting his notes, you weren't spotted at any of the observation posts. I followed the terrain, sir. Cross studied her with newfound interest. That section you moved through has 3 overlapping observation posts. No one gets through there undetected. Rachel maintained her neutral expression. I just went the way I was trained, Lieutenant. And where exactly did you learn those movement techniques? Various training courses, sir. Nothing that isn't available through standard education. Cross clearly didn't believe her, but he had no basis to challenge the statement. Report back to base. We'll debrief this exercise at 1400 hours. As Rachel walked away, Cross made a note in his file. Something wasn't adding up with candidate Morgan, and he intended to find out what. Back in her quarters, Carson was reviewing Rachel's file again, focusing on the redacted sections. Her eyes narrowed as she noticed a pattern in the blackouts. They corresponded to specific time periods: 2003, 2005, 2007, 2020, 11, 2013. Years that aligned with major operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. She picked up her phone and called a contact at personnel records. Dave, it's Carson. I need you to dig deeper on a candidate named Rachel Morgan. Something's not right with her file. What am I looking for? The voice on the other end asked. Anything about her actual background, specifically during these time frames. She read off the years. Those are classified operational periods, Dave said cautiously. If there's nothing in her official file, I probably can't access it. Try anyway. I need to know who she really is before she compromises my program. After hanging up, Carson stared at the wall, replaying the day's observations in her mind. Morgan moved too efficiently, assessed situations too quickly, demonstrated skills that took years to develop. If she was who her file claimed, a civilian contractor with limited exposure, none of it made sense. Carson thought back to her own journey through the system, the barriers she'd faced as a woman in special operations, the constant need to prove herself, the sacrifices she'd made to reach her position. She had built her identity around being exceptional, the woman who had broken through barriers, who had proven the skeptics wrong. Her selection program was her domain, the place where she determined who was worthy to join the elite community she had fought so hard to enter. Morgan threatened that carefully constructed identity. If an older woman could simply walk in and excel, what did that say about Carson's own exceptional status? The captain made a decision. Morgan needed to be exposed one way or another. The clock on her office wall read 48 hours. Carson summoned her trusted inner circle, Lieutenant Miller, Sergeant Thompson, and Specialist Rodriguez. They met in a maintenance shed away from the main buildings. "There's something wrong with Morgan," Carson began, without preamble. "Her file doesn't add up, her skills don't match her background, and she's keeping notes on our training methods." Miller nodded. "I noticed her performance today. That's not beginner's luck." "So what are we thinking?" Thompson asked. "Some kind of observer, inspector general, maybe." "Whatever she is," Carson said, "we need to find out, and we need to do it in a way that exposes her to everyone." They developed a three-phase plan. First, escalate the physical challenges to unsustainable levels. Second, if that failed, create equipment malfunctions that would force errors. And finally, if necessary, the special assessment, a publicly humiliating test that no one could prepare for. "We start tomorrow," Carson concluded. "Whatever game Morgan is playing, it ends now." None of them noticed Fisher standing in the shadows outside the shed, listening to every word. The old sergeant major slipped away silently, heading toward the communications building. He had served too long and seen too much to ignore what was happening. Some things transcended the chain of command. In a secure room, Fisher placed a call to an old friend at the Pentagon, someone who might know what was really going on. The clock read 36 outdoor tertiary. The confrontation was coming. The next morning brought hand-to-hand combat training. The candidates gathered in the combatives' pit, an octagonal space with padded floors and walls where close-quarter fighting techniques were practiced and evaluated. Carson made the announcements. "Today we assess your ability to defend yourself and neutralize threats in confined spaces. I need a volunteer for the first demonstration." Her eyes locked on Rachel. "Morgan." Rachel stepped forward, her face betraying nothing. "I'll be your opponent," Carson said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Let's see what you've got." The other candidates formed a circle around the pit. Carson was 5 inches taller than Rachel and at least 15 years younger, with the defined physique of someone who trained constantly. She had been a collegiate wrestler before joining the military and had competed in Army combatives tournaments at the highest level. As they squared off, Carson's confidence was palpable. This would be the first phase of exposing Morgan, demonstrating her physical limitations in front of everyone. "Begin," Cross called from the sideline. Carson launched forward aggressively, throwing a combination designed to overwhelm her opponent. Rachel slipped the first strike with minimal movement, redirected the second using Carson's own momentum, and countered with a precise strike to a pressure point that left Carson momentarily off balance. The captain recovered quickly, surprise flickering across her face. She hadn't expected such efficiency of movement. Her next attack was more measured, attempting to use her superior size and strength to grapple Rachel to the ground. What happened next stunned everyone watching. Rachel didn't resist the grapple directly. Instead, she seemed to flow around Carson's attack, using subtle shifts in weight and position to end up behind the captain with a submission hold applied so quickly that few saw how it happened. Carson found herself immobilized, Rachel's forearm across her throat in a perfect blood-choked position. Had Rachel applied pressure, Carson would have lost consciousness in seconds. Instead, Rachel immediately released the hold and stepped back to reset. The room fell silent. Carson rose slowly, eyes burning with humiliation and rage. What was supposed to be a demonstration of Morgan's weakness had become a showcase of her unexpected skill. Again, Carson demanded. The second exchange was even more decisive. Carson attacked with fury, abandoning technique for aggression. Rachel redirected the emotional assault with clinical precision, using Carson's momentum to throw her to the mat with an advanced hip toss that spoke of years of high-level training. Cross ended the session before Carson could escalate further. That's enough demonstration. Everyone pair up with someone of similar size for practice. As the candidates dispersed to begin their training, Cross pulled Rachel aside. That wasn't basic self-defense, Morgan. Rachel maintained her neutral expression. I've had some training in various techniques. Those were advanced combat submissions, special operations level techniques. Cross studied her carefully. Who are you really? Just another candidate lieutenant. Cross clearly didn't believe her, but he had no grounds to press further yet. Carry on. Carson watched from across the room, seething with anger and embarrassment. She had been outclassed in front of her entire cadre, and that was unacceptable. Phase 1 of her plan had failed spectacularly, which meant it was time for Phase 2. The afternoon brought the first team exercise. Candidates were divided into 5-person squads for a land navigation and intelligence gathering mission. Carson ensured Rachel was assigned to Alpha Team along with Miller, Thompson, and Rodriguez, her 3 conspirators. Your mission is to navigate 15 miles through contested territory, gather intelligence at 3 designated points, and extract to the pickup zone within the time limit, Carson announced. Morgan will serve as team navigator. Rachel was issued a map and compass for the exercise. The team would be dropped at the starting point by truck, then proceed on foot through dense woodland to their objectives. As Alpha Team prepared their gear, Rachel examined the compass she had been given, noting almost imperceptibly that the needle had been tampered with, offset by several degrees, enough to cause significant navigational errors over distance. She said nothing, simply tucking it into a pocket. When no one was looking, she removed a backup compass from the heel of her boot, standard procedure for anyone who had operated in environments where equipment failure meant death. The clock read 20 seconds. The testing had begun in earnest. Alpha Team was dropped at their starting point as dusk approached. The strategy was simple: use darkness to move undetected toward their first objective, gather the required intelligence, then proceed to points 2 and 3 before extraction. Rachel oriented the map using her concealed compass, established their position, and laid out the route. We'll move along this ridgeline to avoid the likely observation posts here and here, she said, indicating positions on the map. Then drop down to the stream bed for the approach to Objective 1. Miller raised an eyebrow. The stream bed will be slow going. Why not take the more direct route through this clearing? Too exposed, Rachel replied. There will be listening posts covering open ground. The noise discipline in the stream will be worth the extra time. Miller exchanged glances with Thompson, surprised by the tactical awareness that went beyond what a novice should possess. As they moved out, Rodriguez deliberately fell behind at critical moments, creating gaps in the formation that violated basic tactical principles. When Rachel called attention to the problem, Rodriguez responded with hostility. Maybe if you weren't setting such an aggressive pace, we could maintain proper spacing, she snapped. Rachel stopped the team and conducted a brief after-action review, identifying the formation problems, suggesting solutions, and redistributing responsibilities, all without directly accusing anyone of deliberate misconduct. It was a masterclass in small unit leadership that made Miller and Thompson exchange uncomfortable glances. At the first objective, an abandoned building where they needed to photograph documents, Thompson accidentally discharged his weapon, a blank round that echoed through the quiet forest. According to the exercise rules, this compromised the mission and should have resulted in failure. Rachel, however, immediately implemented an alternative approach. The original entry point is compromised, she said calmly, but we can still accomplish the objective by creating a diversion here while accessing through the basement entrance on the north side. Her modified plan worked flawlessly. Using natural sounds to coordinate movements and creating multiple false indicators of their position, the team successfully gathered the required intelligence and extracted without further compromise. What should have been a devastating failure had been transformed into a successful mission completion through Rachel's adaptability and leadership. Miller was growing increasingly uncomfortable with the sabotage attempts. "This isn't working," he whispered to Thompson during a brief rest. "She's turning every obstacle into a teaching moment. It's like she's been through this exact scenario before." Thompson nodded grimly. Carson isn't going to be happy. The clock read 12, so when Alpha Team returned to base after successfully completing all objectives, despite the deliberate sabotage, Carson was waiting. Her face showed poorly concealed anger at their success. "Debrief in 10 minutes, she ordered, then pulled Miller aside. "What happened out there?" "She's good, Captain," Miller admitted reluctantly. "Every time we created a problem, she found a solution we hadn't anticipated." Carson's jaw tightened. "Then we moved to Phase 3. Tonight." During the evening planning session for the next day's exercise, Rachel pulled out her notebook and began documenting the day's observations. Carson approached her patients, finally exhausted. "What exactly are you writing in there, Morgan?" she demanded. "Training observations, Captain. Standard procedure for improvement." "Standard for who? I've been through a dozen advanced programs, and I've never seen anyone document exercises like you do." Carson extended her hand. "Give me the notebook." The room fell silent as everyone sensed the confrontation building. Rachel closed the notebook and secured it in her pocket. "I prefer to keep my notes private, Captain." "That wasn't a request, Morgan. That was an order. Hand over the notebook." Rachel met Carson's gaze steadily. "With respect, Captain, personal notes are not subject to inspection unless there's reason to believe they contain classified information or evidence of misconduct." Carson's face flushed with anger. "You're questioning my authority." "No, Captain. I'm stating policy." The tension in the room was palpable. Carson leaned closer, her voice low and dangerous. "Whatever game you're playing, it ends tomorrow. I promise you that." As she walked away, Rachel remained impassive, but she had registered the threat. The final confrontation was coming. The clock read 3:00. The morning of day 3 dawned with unusual activity. Senior officers had arrived to observe the final evaluation exercise. Among them was Colonel Richards, the program commander, and General Hamilton from Special Operations Command. Fisher stood at the edge of the formation, and beside him was an older man in civilian clothes whom no one recognized. Carson addressed the assembled candidates. "Today's exercise will test everything you've learned. Small teams will infiltrate a mock enemy compound, gather intelligence, rescue a simulated hostage, and extract under fire." She paused for effect. "Team assignments are posted. You have 30 minutes to review the mission briefing and prepare." Rachel checked the assignment roster. She had been placed in Alpha Team led by Carson with Miller, Thompson, and Rodriguez as her teammates. It wasn't a coincidence. The mission parameters were complex. The target compound contained multiple buildings with perimeter security and roving patrols. The hostage was located in a central structure that could only be accessed after neutralizing several security checkpoints. Time limits were tight, failure conditions numerous. As Alpha Team gathered to plan their approach, Carson took command. "We'll use a direct assault on the main entrance. Overwhelming force, speed, and aggression." Rachel studied the tactical map carefully. "The main entrance is designed to channel attackers into a kill zone," she noted. "We'd be eliminated before reaching the first checkpoint." Carson's eyes narrowed. "You have a better idea, Morgan." "Deception and misdirection," Rachel replied, pointing to specific features on the map. "Create a diversion at the primary entrance while the actual assault team approaches from the secondary position. Use the compound's own defensive measures against them." Miller snorted derisively. "That's the kind of complicated nonsense that gets people killed in real operations. Simple and direct is better." "Simple and direct works when you have overwhelming superiority," Rachel replied calmly. "When you don't, you need to be smarter than your opponent." Carson ignored Rachel's assessment. "We're going with the direct approach. Any questions?" There were none. The stage was set. When the exercise began, Carson immediately implemented her frontal assault plan. The result was predictable. The team was killed by defensive fires before they had advanced 50 meters into the compound. According to exercise rules, they now had to complete the mission with simulated casualties and reduced capabilities. "Outstanding leadership, Captain," Rachel said quietly as they regrouped. Carson's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. The mission was going exactly as badly as Rachel had predicted, making Carson look incompetent in front of the evaluators. That's when Carson made the decision that would change everything. "New plan," she announced, her voice carrying a tone that broke no argument. "Morgan, you're taking point on the next assault. Solo penetration of the main compound while we provide overwatch." It was effectively a suicide mission requiring Rachel to advance alone against multiple defensive positions with no realistic hope of success. Rachel studied the compound layout one final time, her mind automatically calculating angles, timing, and probability curves. She nodded. Understood. I'll need 5 minutes to plan the approach. No, Carson replied sharply. You go now with the equipment you have. Show us these skills you claim to possess. The other team members looked uncomfortable, recognizing that Carson had crossed a line from training evaluation into personal vendetta. Rachel simply nodded acknowledgement and began checking her gear with routine efficiency, initiating solo assault in 30 seconds. Carson watched Rachel prepare for what should have been professional suicide and felt a growing sense of unease. Rachel wasn't showing any signs of stress or fear. If anything, she looked more focused and purposeful than she had during any previous exercise. The evaluators had moved closer to observe, their attention focused entirely on what was about to happen. Cross was speaking quietly into his radio, coordinating with other instructor teams monitoring the exercise. Any specific intelligence requirements or just successful hostage recovery? Rachel asked calmly. Just don't get yourself killed, Carson replied, though her tone suggested she wouldn't be particularly upset if Rachel failed spectacularly. Rachel nodded and disappeared into the tree line with a fluidity that left observers blinking in surprise. One moment she was there, the next she was gone, as if the forest had simply absorbed her. The evaluators exchanged glances and began tracking her movement through the compound's sensor network. What they saw defied everything they thought they knew about the quiet woman who had been dismissed as an unqualified pretender. The clock read 000. The storm had arrived. What happened next would be analyzed by military instructors for years to come. Rachel didn't just attempt the impossible mission Carson had assigned her. She redefined what the evaluators thought was possible within the parameters of the exercise. Her approach to the compound was so sophisticated that the electronic monitoring systems initially lost track of her, mistaking her movement patterns for natural background noise rather than human infiltration. She had studied the compound's defensive layout with the eye of someone who had spent years analyzing real enemy installations, where a single mistake meant death rather than training failure. The route she chose avoided the obvious approach paths while exploiting weaknesses in sensor coverage that even the exercise designers hadn't fully considered. When she reached the perimeter, she didn't crash through defenses. She flowed around them like water, finding the path of least resistance. The first indication that something extraordinary was happening came when the compound's guards began reporting equipment malfunctions. Sensors were going offline in sequence. Communication systems were experiencing mysterious interference. Patrol routes were being disrupted by what appeared to be coordinated equipment failures. The exercise controllers initially assumed they were dealing with technical problems, rather than recognizing they were witnessing a masterclass in electronic warfare and psychological operations. Carson and her team, monitoring from their overwatch position, watched in growing disbelief as Rachel systematically dismantled the compound's defenses. Every assumption they had made about her capabilities was being proven wrong in real time. This wasn't the performance of someone who had learned military tactics from textbooks or civilian courses. This was operational art practiced by someone who had used these skills in situations where failure meant capture, torture, or death. "How is she doing that?" Rodriguez whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and terror. Through their observation scopes, they could see Rachel moving through the compound with a kind of precision that came from years of specialized training and real-world application. Miller was frantically trying to track Rachel's movement through his scope, but she kept disappearing into shadows and blind spots that shouldn't have existed. "She's ghost walking," he muttered. "That's not something they teach in regular training. That's special operations stuff. Black Ops level." Carson said nothing, but her face had gone pale with the realization that she had made a catastrophic error in judgment. The quiet woman she had dismissed as a fraud was demonstrating capabilities that belonged in classified operation reports rather than training exercises. The climax came when Rachel reached the building where the simulated hostage was being held. Instead of attempting a direct assault on the heavily defended structure, she implemented a deception operation that convinced the guards the real attack was coming from a completely different direction. While they repositioned to meet the phantom threat, Rachel extracted the hostage through a route that had been considered impossible by the exercise planners. Lieutenant Cross, monitoring the exercise from the command post, reached for his radio to verify that what he was seeing was actually happening. Rachel had completed in 18 minutes what the exercise designers had estimated would take a full team at least an hour to accomplish. "Sir," one of the monitoring technicians said, his voice filled with confusion. "The candidate designated Rachel Morgan has successfully completed all mission objectives. Hostage recovered. Intelligence gathered. 0 casualties sustained. Time to completion 18 minutes 43 seconds. Cross stared at the tactical display showing Rachel's route through the compound. The path she had taken was so sophisticated that it looked like it had been planned by someone with intimate knowledge of the facility's design and defensive protocols. "Run it again," Cross ordered. "Check all the sensors, verify the timeline, confirm that she actually accomplished everything the monitors are showing." While the technicians verified Rachel's impossible performance, she was making her way back to the rally point where Carson's team was supposed to be providing Overwatch support. But when she arrived, she found them in heated argument with each other, their unity fractured by the reality of what they had just witnessed. "That's not possible," Carson was saying, her voice sharp with denial. "Nobody completes that mission solo. Nobody has those kinds of skills without it being documented somewhere." "Maybe it is documented," Miller replied quietly. "Maybe it's documented in files we don't have clearance to see." The suggestion hung in the air like a physical presence. If Rachel's capabilities were classified at levels above their security clearance, it would explain everything the redacted personnel filed a mysterious assignment to their program, the professional competence that seemed to come from nowhere. It would also mean that their campaign of harassment had been directed at someone whose actual authority and credentials went far beyond anything they'd imagined. Rachel emerged from the tree line with the kind of silence that made everyone jump. Despite having just completed what should have been an exhausting solo mission, she wasn't breathing hard. Her equipment was properly secured, her uniform still regulation correct, and her expression was as calm and professional as if she'd just returned from a routine training walk. "Mission complete," she reported to Carson with military formality. "Hostage recovered. Intelligence gathered. Extraction accomplished without compromise. Are there any additional tasking requirements?" Carson stared at Rachel as if seeing her for the first time. The woman standing in front of her wasn't the uncertain civilian candidate she'd been harassing for 3 days. This was someone who had just demonstrated capabilities that belonged in special operations units, someone who operated with the kind of calm confidence that came from surviving real combat operations. "Who are you?" Carson asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before Rachel could respond, Lieutenant Cross's voice crackled over their team radio. "All teams return to base immediately for debriefing. Team Alpha remain in position until instructed otherwise." The radio call carried an urgency that suggested Rachel's performance had triggered protocols none of them understood. Within minutes, vehicles were approaching their position, carrying instructors and officials whose presence indicated that the routine training exercise had become something much more serious. Rachel watched the approaching convoy with the same calm professionalism she'd shown throughout the exercise, but internally she was calculating probabilities and preparing for multiple contingencies. Her cover had been blown not by enemy action, but by her own competence. Now she would have to deal with the consequences of being revealed as something other than what she'd claimed to be. The time for pretending to be an ordinary candidate was over. Whatever happened next would depend on decisions being made by people whose authority went far beyond a training facility in North Carolina. Rachel had accomplished her mission of evaluating the program's effectiveness, but she'd also exposed capabilities that were supposed to remain classified at the highest levels of national security. Master Sergeant Alexander Kane stepped out of the lead vehicle with the kind of measured authority that came from 30 years of special operations experience. At 68, Kane had seen everything the military had to offer, from routine training through exercises to classified missions that would never appear in any official record. His weathered face carried scars from operations in 3 different theaters, and his eyes held the kind of steady intelligence that came from making life and death decisions under impossible pressure. Kane had been monitoring Rachel's exercise performance from the command center, watching through electronic surveillance as she systematically dismantled defenses that had been designed by some of the military's best tactical minds. What he'd witnessed wasn't just exceptional performance, It was operational art practiced at a level that suggested training and experience available to only a handful of people in the entire world. Behind Kane, Captain Robert Pierce emerged from the second vehicle, his expression grim with the kind of seriousness that preceded career-ending conversations. Pierce was the commanding officer of the entire training facility, a man whose decisions affected the careers of hundreds of elite operators, and he looked like someone who had just realized that a routine training exercise had become a national security matter. Carson and her team stood at attention as the senior officers approached, but their military bearing couldn't hide the confusion and fear radiating from them. They'd spent 3 days harassing someone they'd assumed was unqualified, and now they were facing the possibility that their target had been operating under authority that went far above their pay grade. "Stand at ease," Kane commanded, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made everyone immediately comply. His eyes swept the group, taking in their obvious nervousness before settling on Rachel with an expression that was difficult to read. Rachel remained at attention despite the command to relax, her posture perfect, her expression neutral. But there was something in her eyes, now a recognition, perhaps, or an acknowledgement that the game was finally over and real communication could begin. "Candidate Morgan," Kane said, his voice carefully controlled, "your performance during today's exercise has raised some questions that require immediate clarification." "Yes, sir," Rachel replied, her voice steady and professional. Kane pulled out a tablet and consulted information that was clearly classified above the security clearance of everyone else present. "According to our records, you're here as a civilian candidate with limited military background. But what we just observed suggests capabilities that are inconsistent with that assessment." Carson couldn't contain herself any longer. "Sir, she's been acting suspicious since day one. The way she takes notes, the equipment she carries, the techniques she uses, none of it matches her official story." Kane's gaze shifted to Carson with a kind of cold assessment that made seasoned operators uncomfortable. "Captain Carson, your concerns have been noted. However, you're not qualified to make judgments about operational capabilities or security classifications." The rebuke was delivered with surgical precision, making it clear that Carson had overstepped her authority in ways that could have serious consequences. But Kane wasn't finished. "In fact," he continued, "your behavior toward candidate Morgan has been documented and will be subject to review by appropriate authorities. Harassment of personnel operating under classified authority is a serious matter." The words hit Carson like a physical blow. If Rachel was operating under classified authority, then everything Carson had done, the harassment, the sabotage, the public humiliation, constituted interference with a classified operation. The kind of interference that ended careers and sometimes led to criminal charges. Kane turned back to Rachel, his expression softening slightly. "I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need a direct answer. Are you operating under presidential directive?" The question hung in the air like an explosive device waiting for detonation. Presidential directives were among the most classified authorities in the entire government, reserved for operations that affected national security at the highest levels. The fact that Kane was even asking the question suggested that Rachel's true identity was far more significant than anyone had imagined. Rachel met Kane's eyes with steady confidence. "Sir, I am not authorized to discuss the details of my assignment without proper authentication protocols." It was neither confirmation nor denial, but it was the kind of response that someone operating under presidential authority would give when questioned by unauthorized personnel. Kane nodded slowly as if he'd received exactly the answer he'd expected. "Very well." He turned to Captain Pierce and spoke quietly, using terms that the candidates couldn't hear, but that clearly carried significant weight. Pierce's expression grew increasingly serious as the conversation continued, and when it ended, he was looking at Rachel with the kind of respect reserved for very senior officials. Kane walked back to his vehicle and returned with a secure communication device. After a brief conversation using codes that confirmed he was speaking to very high-level authority, he approached Rachel again. "I've been authorized to request verification of your credentials," he said formally. "If you are operating under presidential directive, you'll need to provide proof of your authority." Rachel nodded calmly and began removing her tactical vest and outer uniform shirt. The action sent a ripple of surprise through the assembled group. It seemed like an inappropriate response to a request for identification, But as Rachel turned to expose her back, the reason for her actions became immediately clear. Running down the length of her spine was an intricate tattoo that made Kane's breath catch in his throat. The Presidential Service Badge, rendered in elaborate detail with a distinctive eagle and shield design, was reserved for personnel who had served in direct support of presidential operations. But this wasn't just any presidential service tattoo. The additional elements surrounding the central design indicated service in classified operations that required special authorization from the Oval Office itself. Kane had seen presidential service tattoos before, but never one that included the specific symbols and design elements that marked Rachel's back. The classification level indicated by those symbols was so high that Kane himself didn't have clearance to access the files that would explain what operations they represented. "Sweet Mother of God," Kane whispered, his professional composure cracking for the first time in decades. Carson, Miller, and Rodriguez stared at the tattoo with growing horror as they began to understand the magnitude of their error. They hadn't been harassing an unqualified civilian. They'd been interfering with someone whose authority came directly from the highest levels of government. Captain Pierce stepped closer to examine the tattoo, his face pale with the realization that his facility had been hosting a presidential operative without his knowledge. The security implications alone were staggering, but the potential consequences for the personnel who'd been harassing her were even worse. "Ma'am," Pierce said, his voice carrying formal respect that was a stark contrast to the casual dismissal she'd faced for 3 days. "I need to apologize for any inappropriate treatment you may have received while operating at this facility." Rachel pulled her shirt back on with the same calm efficiency she brought to everything else. "No apology necessary, Captain. The exercise provided valuable data about training protocols and personnel evaluation procedures." The simple statement revealed the true purpose of Rachel's presence at the facility. She hadn't been there to complete training. She'd been there to evaluate it, to assess the effectiveness of current protocols and identify areas for improvement. The harassment she'd endured, the challenges she'd faced, the hostility she'd overcome, all of it had been data points in an assessment that would influence how the military trained its most elite operators. Kane was already reaching for his radio, initiating communications that would set in motion a chain of events reaching to the highest levels of military command. Rachel's cover had been blown. Her mission parameters had changed, and the quiet evaluation that was supposed to remain invisible had become a very public revelation of capabilities that most people weren't cleared to know existed. The candidates who had dismissed her as weak, who had questioned her right to wear the uniform, who had tried to force her out of the program, were about to learn that they had been tested by someone whose authority to evaluate their fitness for service came directly from the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Armed Forces. The silence that followed Rachel's revelation stretched across the North Carolina training ground like a physical presence. Carson, Miller, and Rodriguez stood frozen in mortification, their minds struggling to process the magnitude of their error. They had spent 3 days systematically harassing someone whose authority came directly from the Oval Office, someone whose evaluation of their conduct would be read by officials whose names appeared on classified documents that shaped national security policy. Master Sergeant Kane was the first to break the silence, his voice carrying the weight of immediate command authority. "Captain Carson, Sergeant Thompson, Specialist Rodriguez, you are hereby relieved of all training responsibilities pending a comprehensive review of your conduct during this exercise period." The words fell like hammer blows, each one representing the end of military careers that had taken years to build. Relief from training responsibilities was military code for career termination, especially when it involved interference with classified operations. Carson's face had gone ashen, but her pride wouldn't allow her to accept the situation quietly. "Sir, with all due respect, we had no way of knowing." "You had no way of knowing because you made assumptions based on appearances rather than conducting proper assessment." Kane interrupted, his tone cutting through Carson's attempted defense. "Military effectiveness depends on recognizing competence, regardless of how it's packaged. Your failure to do so represents a fundamental deficiency in judgment that disqualifies you from Special Operations service." Captain Pierce stepped forward with a tablet in his hand, already pulling up documentation that would formalize the consequences. "Captain Carson, your conduct toward Operative Morgan has been recorded by multiple surveillance systems. Deliberate equipment, sabotage, coordinated harassment, and attempted mission compromise constitute violations of multiple sections of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The charges were serious enough to end more than just Carson's military career. They carried potential civilian criminal penalties for interfering with classified government operations. Carson opened her mouth to protest, then closed it as she realized that anything she said would only make her situation worse. Miller, meanwhile, was calculating the full scope of his exposure. His role in sabotaging Rachel's equipment during field exercises had been captured on training facility security cameras. What he'd thought were justifiable pressure tactics to expose an unqualified candidate was now documented evidence of criminal interference with a presidential directive operation. Sergeant Miller Pierce continued consulting his tablet. Your deliberate sabotage of navigation equipment and communication systems during field exercises represents destruction of government property and interference with classified operations. You're facing both military tribunal and potential federal criminal charges. Rodriguez, the youngest of the three, finally grasped the reality of their situation and broke down completely. We didn't know, she said, her voice cracking with panic. She never said anything about being undercover. How were we supposed to know? Rachel spoke for the first time since revealing her tattoo, her voice carrying the calm authority that came from years of operating in situations where mistakes had life and death consequences. The assumption that competence must announce itself is precisely the kind of thinking that gets operatives killed in the field. Your inability to recognize capability when it doesn't match your preconceptions represents a fundamental security vulnerability. Her words carried weight beyond simple criticism. They were professional assessments that would be included in reports that influenced how the military selected and trained special operations personnel. Rachel hadn't just been enduring harassment. She'd been documenting systematic failures in personnel evaluation that had national security implications. Kane was already coordinating with higher authority through his secure communication device, using codes that indicated direct communication with Pentagon-level command. The conversation was brief but clearly decisive, and when it ended, Kane's expression was grim with the certainty of consequences that couldn't be appealed or modified. Effective immediately, Kane announced, all three candidates are terminated from this program and will be transferred to administrative hold pending final disposition of charges. Their security clearances are suspended, and they are prohibited from discussing any aspect of this incident with unauthorized personnel. The administrative language couldn't disguise the severity of what was happening. Carson, Miller, and Rodriguez were being removed not just from the training program, but from any position where they could pose a security risk. Their military careers were over, and their future prospects in any field requiring security clearance had been eliminated. But the consequences extended beyond the three primary antagonists. Kane turned to address the other candidates who had witnessed the confrontation, his voice carrying a warning that was unmistakable in its implications. Let me be clear about something, he said, his eyes sweeping across the assembled trainees. Operative Morgan has been conducting a classified assessment of this facility's training protocols and personnel evaluation procedures. Every interaction, every comment, every demonstration of judgment or lack thereof has been documented and will be included in her final report. The revelation sent a chill through the candidates who had remained silent during Rachel's harassment. They suddenly realized that their failure to intervene, their willingness to go along with obviously inappropriate behavior, their complicity in systematic harassment, all of it had been observed and recorded by someone whose evaluation would determine their future in special operations. Several candidates who had participated in the casual mockery of Rachel during the first days began to understand that their careers might also be in jeopardy. The military's zero-tolerance policy for harassment was well known, but harassment of a presidential operative carried implications that went far beyond normal disciplinary action. Rachel pulled out her notebook, the same notebook that had been the subject of so much speculation and suspicion, and began writing with the methodical precision that had frustrated her tormentors for 3 days. But now, watching her document the morning's events, everyone understood what they were really seeing. This wasn't a training diary or personal observations. This was an official after-action report that would be read by officials whose decisions shaped military policy at the highest levels. Ma'am, one of the candidates who had remained neutral during the harassment asked hesitantly, will your report include recommendations about personnel who didn't participate in the inappropriate behavior? Rachel looked up from her notebook with an expression that was professional but not unkind. My report will include assessment of all personnel observed during this evaluation period, with particular attention to judgment, professionalism, and adherence to military values under stress. It was a diplomatic way of saying that everyone's behavior had been noted and would be evaluated according to standards that went far beyond simple task completion. Leadership under pressure, moral courage, in the face of inappropriate behavior. Professional ethics, when authority figures weren't watching all of it, had been part of the test, and most of them had failed without realizing they were being evaluated. Lieutenant Cross, who had been observing the confrontation with growing unease, finally understood the full scope of what had been happening under his command. For 3 days, he had been witnessing systematic harassment of a presidential operative while doing nothing to intervene. His failure to recognize and stop the inappropriate behavior represented a massive leadership failure that would be documented in reports that reached the highest levels of military command. As military police vehicles arrived to escort Carson Miller and Rodriguez from the facility, Rachel continued writing in her notebook with the same calm efficiency she'd shown throughout her entire assignment. The quiet woman who had been dismissed as weak had systematically documented failures in personnel evaluation, leadership development, and military culture that would influence special operations training for years to come. The exercise was over, but the real consequences were just beginning. Rachel's report would trigger changes in how the military identified and developed elite operators, how it assessed character under pressure, and how it ensured that personal prejudices didn't compromise mission effectiveness. The harassment she'd endured had become data that would protect future operatives from similar treatment while improving the quality of personnel selected for the most demanding military assignments. Within 48 hours of Rachel's revelation, the U.S. Army John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center underwent the most comprehensive policy overhaul in its 30-year history. The changes began at the highest levels of command and cascaded down through every aspect of training, protocols, personnel evaluation, and facility culture, with the kind of systematic efficiency that only came from direct presidential directive. Captain Robert Pierce found himself in the uncomfortable position of explaining to admirals and generals how a presidential operative had been systematically harassed under his command for 3 days without any intervention from facility leadership. The secure video conference that determined his fate included faces from the Pentagon, the White House, and agencies whose names didn't appear on any public organizational charts. Captain Pierce, the voice from Washington, was cold with barely controlled anger. How exactly did your facility fail to recognize a presidential operative for 21 days? Pierce had been dreading this question since Rachel's identity was revealed. Sir, the operative's cover identity was comprehensive and professionally maintained. Her documentation appeared consistent with civilian candidate protocols. That's not what I'm asking, Captain. The voice belonged to a general whose decisions shaped special operations policy across all branches of the military. I'm asking how your training environment became so toxic that a decorated operative was subjected to harassment that would have been unacceptable under any circumstances. The question cut to the heart of the institutional failures that Rachel's assignment had been designed to identify. Her harassment hadn't been the result of her cover identity. It had been the result of a training culture that tolerated bullying, encouraged prejudice, and rewarded aggression over competence. Pierce's career ended with a brief formal statement that cited his failure to maintain appropriate training environment standards. But his removal was just the beginning of changes that would transform how the military's most elite units identified and developed personnel. Rachel's first official act in her new role as Director of Advanced Training Assessment was to implement a comprehensive review of candidate evaluation protocols. The conference room where she'd been briefed on her new responsibilities was filled with officials whose authority spanned multiple agencies and government departments. The current system, Rachel said, consulting the detailed analysis she'd compiled during her undercover assignment, prioritizes obvious demonstrations of competence over actual capability assessment. This creates systematic bias against operatives whose strengths don't conform to traditional expectations. She activated a presentation that displayed statistical analysis of candidate performance correlated with harassment incidents. The data was stark and undeniable. Some of the most effective operatives were also the most likely to face inappropriate treatment from peers and instructors who couldn't recognize competence that didn't announce itself aggressively. Recommendation 1, Rachel continued, implement blind evaluation protocols where candidate assessment is separated from demographic information and social dynamics. Competence should be measured by results, not by conformity to expected behavior patterns. The recommendation carried weight because it came from someone who had personally experienced the consequences of evaluation bias. Rachel's assignment had provided data that couldn't be disputed or rationalized away evidence that institutional prejudices were compromising the military's ability to identify and develop its most valuable personnel. Within a week, training facilities across all branches of the military began implementing Rachel's assessment protocols. The changes were comprehensive and immediate, affecting everything from initial candidate screening to final graduation requirements. The most significant innovation was the introduction of mystery operative exercises, where candidates were evaluated on their ability to recognize competence, regardless of how it was packaged. Teams would include undercover instructors whose job was to assess how well candidates could identify and work with capable personnel who didn't fit conventional expectations. Lieutenant Cross, whose leadership failures during Rachel's harassment had been thoroughly documented, found himself reassigned to a position where his decisions couldn't affect personnel development. His replacement was specifically chosen for demonstrated ability to recognize and develop unconventional talent. The training protocols also addressed the systematic bullying that had characterized facility culture for years. Rachel's documentation of harassment patterns had revealed that inappropriate behavior was often rationalized as building character or testing resolve, when it was actually just institutionalized cruelty that drove away exactly the kind of innovative thinkers the military needed most. Zero tolerance means zero tolerance, the new facility commander announced during his first all-hands meeting. Harassment will result in immediate termination regardless of the perpetrator's rank, performance record, or connections. This facility exists to develop elite operators, not to provide an outlet for personal insecurities. But the most profound changes were in how competence itself was defined and measured. Rachel's performance during her undercover assignment had demonstrated that the most valuable operators weren't necessarily the most obvious ones. Her ability to observe, analyze, and adapt had proven more valuable than any amount of aggressive self-promotion or conventional military bearing. Training scenarios were redesigned to reward problem-solving over power projection, collaboration over domination, and analytical thinking over reflexive aggression. The changes didn't eliminate physical standards or reduce the demanding nature of special operations training, but they expanded the definition of what made an effective operator. Psychological evaluation protocols were completely overhauled based on Rachel's analysis of personality types that succeeded in real operations versus those that succeeded in training environments. Her research had identified critical gaps between the qualities that impressed instructors and the qualities that actually contributed to mission success in classified operations. The most dangerous operatives, Rachel explained to a gathering of training command officials, are often the ones who blend into any environment, who can assess situations without revealing their capabilities, who can influence outcomes without drawing attention to themselves. These are precisely the qualities that traditional evaluation methods fail to identify. Her words carried special weight because everyone in the room had witnessed exactly that phenomenon. Rachel had operated under their observation for 3 weeks, demonstrating extraordinary capabilities that none of them had recognized until she chose to reveal them. The changes extended beyond training protocols to fundamental shifts in military culture. Facilities began implementing mentorship programs designed to identify and develop personnel whose strengths might not be immediately obvious. Leadership development courses were expanded to include training on recognizing diverse forms of competence and creating inclusive environments where all types of talent could flourish. Rachel's influence reached far beyond the facility where she'd conducted her undercover assessment. Her recommendations were being implemented in special operations training programs across all branches of the military, affecting how thousands of personnel would be evaluated and developed over the coming years. The quiet woman who had been dismissed as weak and unqualified had become the architect of a new approach to identifying and developing military excellence. Her harassment had been transformed into data that would protect future generations of operatives, while ensuring that the military's most demanding assignments were filled by the most capable personnel, regardless of whether their competence announced itself in traditional ways. But perhaps the most significant change was in the understanding of what strength really meant in special operations. Rachel had proven that true power often remained hidden until the moment it was needed most, that the most effective operators were those who could influence outcomes without revealing their capabilities, and that the military's most valuable assets were often its most underestimated personnel. The transformation was comprehensive, systematic, and permanent. The harassment Rachel had endured for 3 days would prevent similar treatment for countless others, while ensuring that the military's most elite units were filled with personnel whose competence had been properly recognized and developed. Her sacrifice had become the foundation for a better way of identifying and training the operators who would protect national security in an increasingly complex world. 2 years after Rachel Morgan's revelation at Fort Bragg, the ripple effects of her undercover assessment had transformed special operations training across the entire United States military establishment. The changes she'd initiated extended far beyond simple policy modifications. They represented a fundamental shift in how the world's most powerful military identified, developed, and deployed its most valuable human assets. The statistical evidence of transformation was undeniable. Graduation rates from special operations programs had increased by 38%. But more importantly, the quality of graduates had improved dramatically. Mission success rates for units trained under Rachel's revised protocols showed a 23% improvement over previous standards with significantly reduced casualty rates in high-risk operations. But the numbers only told part of the story. The real transformation was cultural, affecting how military personnel at every level understood the relationship between competence and appearance, between strength and visibility, between leadership and self-promotion. Rachel's experience had become a case study taught in military academies, staff colleges, and leadership development programs throughout the armed forces. General Patricia Hammond, the four-star general who had overseen the implementation of Rachel's recommendations, stood before a gathering of international military leaders at the Pentagon, explaining how the American approach to special operations training had evolved. The Morgan Protocol, as Rachel's assessment framework had become known, was being studied and adapted by allied military forces around the world. Traditional evaluation methods, Hammond explained to the assembled officials, were designed for conventional warfare paradigms where obvious displays of competence correlated with battlefield effectiveness. Modern special operations require personnel who can blend into any environment, who can influence outcomes without revealing their capabilities, who can succeed through intelligence rather than intimidation. The audience included military leaders from 23 countries, all seeking to understand how the American military had achieved such dramatic improvements in special operations effectiveness. Rachel's insights were being requested by NATO allies, Pacific Partnership nations, and friendly governments whose security depended on the quality of their elite military units. Rachel herself had been promoted to the newly created position of Director of Global Training Assessment, with authority that spanned all branches of the American military and extended to advisory roles with allied forces. Her office in the Pentagon was modest and functional, decorated with commendations from operations that remained classified and photographs of training facilities she'd helped redesign around the world. The most significant long-term impact was in personnel retention and development. Before Rachel's reforms, approximately 40% of special operations personnel left military service within 5 years of completing training, often citing toxic work environments and failure of leadership to recognize their contributions. Under the new protocols, retention rates had improved to over 70%, with personnel reporting dramatically higher satisfaction with their career development opportunities. Dr. Amanda Foster, the military psychologist who had worked with Rachel to develop new assessment frameworks, published research that demonstrated the correlation between inclusive training environments and operational effectiveness. When personnel feel valued for their actual contributions rather than their ability to conform to stereotypical expectations, Foster wrote, their performance improves across all measurable metrics. The research had implications beyond military applications. Corporate leadership programs, law enforcement training academies, and emergency response organizations were adapting Rachel's insights to improve their own personnel development strategies. The principles she'd identified, that competence often remained hidden until properly recognized, that diverse approaches to problem-solving improved outcomes, that harassment was always counterproductive regardless of its justification, were proving valuable across multiple sectors. International military exchanges had become opportunities to share Rachel's methodologies with allied forces. British Special Air Service training incorporated her mystery operative exercises. Israeli Defense Forces adapted her bias recognition protocols. Australian Special Forces implemented her collaborative leadership development programs. The approaches that had emerged from Rachel's harassment were becoming standard practice for elite military units worldwide. Perhaps most importantly, the military had developed institutional memory about the cost of prejudice and the value of recognizing hidden talent. Rachel's experience was taught as required curriculum in officer training programs, ensuring that future military leaders understood how assumptions about competence could compromise mission effectiveness in personnel development. The case studies were powerful and specific. Rachel's documentation had provided concrete examples of how harassment affected performance, how bias influenced evaluation, and how institutional culture could either support or undermine the development of critical capabilities. Military academies used her data to teach courses on leadership ethics and organizational effectiveness. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chun had been one of the first officers trained under the new protocols. 5 years later, she commanded a special operations unit that had achieved unprecedented success in classified missions across 3 different theaters of operation. The Morgan method taught us to look beyond obvious indicators of capability, Chun explained to a group of junior officers during a leadership development seminar. Some of our most effective operators are people who would have been overlooked or harassed under the old system. We've learned to identify and develop talent regardless of how it's packaged. The transformation had also affected how the military recruited new personnel. Recruiting protocols had been modified to identify candidates whose potential might not be immediately obvious, whose backgrounds might not fit traditional patterns, whose strengths might emerge only under specific conditions. The pool of potential special operations personnel had expanded significantly, improving both quality and diversity. Rachel's influence extended to international counterterrorism cooperation, where her insights about recognizing hidden capabilities had proven crucial for identifying and neutralizing threats that operated through deception and misdirection. Intelligence agencies had adapted her analytical frameworks to improve their assessment of both friendly and hostile operatives, whose true capabilities remained concealed. The technology sector had also taken notice of Rachel's work, particularly her research on how organizational bias affected innovation and problem-solving. Silicon Valley companies began implementing modified versions of her assessment protocols to identify and develop technical talent that might not conform to traditional expectations. But the most meaningful impact was personal and immediate. The thousands of military personnel who were now serving effectively in positions they might never have achieved under the old system. Rachel received letters from operatives around the world thanking her for creating environments where their contributions were recognized and valued. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, who had been dismissed from special operations training twice under the old protocols, had become one of the military's most decorated intelligence specialists after being reevaluated under Rachel's frameworks. The new system saw what the old system missed, Rodriguez wrote in a letter that Rachel kept in her desk drawer. I'm finally able to serve my country using the capabilities I've always had. And the transformation was ongoing and accelerating. Each year brought new refinements to Rachel's original insights, new applications of her principles, and new evidence that recognizing hidden competence was essential for organizational effectiveness in an increasingly complex world. Her 3 days of harassment had become the foundation for decades of improved military performance and personnel development. 5 years after the morning when Captain Melissa Carson had demanded that Rachel Morgan strip in front of 200 elite trainees, Rachel stood in her Pentagon office reviewing classified reports that detailed the global impact of her undercover assessment. The walls around her displayed commendations from operations that would never be publicly acknowledged, photographs from training facilities on 6 continents, and letters from personnel whose careers had been shaped by the changes she'd initiated. The presidential tattoo that had frozen Master Sergeant Kane in recognition remained hidden beneath her dress uniform, but its significance had evolved far beyond its original meaning. What had once been a mark of individual service had become a symbol of institutional transformation, representing the military's commitment to recognizing competence regardless of how it was packaged or presented. Rachel's morning briefing included updates from special operations units around the world, Dolcar reporting improved performance metrics under training, protocols that emphasize substance over appearance, results over rhetoric, competence over conformity. The data was consistently positive, but Rachel knew that the real measure of success wasn't statistical. It was the individual stories of personnel who were now serving effectively in positions they might never have achieved under the old system. Her secure telephone rang with a distinctive tone that indicated a call from the highest levels of government. The voice on the other end belonged to the current President of the United States, the third Commander-in-Chief to personally consult with Rachel about military personnel development during her tenure as Director of Global Training Assessment. Rachel, the President said, using the informal address that had become standard for their consultations, I wanted to personally thank you for the latest assessment of our Pacific operations capabilities. Your recommendations are being implemented immediately. The conversation lasted 15 minutes and covered topics that would influence military policy for years to come. Rachel's insights, born from her experience of being systematically underestimated and harassed, had become essential input for decisions that affected national security at the strategic level. After ending the call, Rachel returned to the document she'd been reviewing, a comprehensive analysis of how the Morgan Protocol had influenced military effectiveness over the past 5 years. The improvements were measurable and significant, but they also represented something more profound than enhanced operational capability. The military had learned to see strength where it had previously seen weakness, to recognize leadership where it had previously seen submission to value, analytical thinking where it had previously rewarded aggressive self-promotion. The changes weren't just procedural, they were philosophical, affecting how the world's most powerful military understood the relationship between competence and appearance. Rachel's influence extended far beyond the American military establishment. International military academies taught courses based on her research. Allied special operations units had implemented modified versions of her assessment frameworks. Intelligence agencies around the world used her insights to better identify and develop personnel whose capabilities might not be immediately obvious. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of Rachel's legacy was its impact on individual lives. Her office files contained thousands of letters from military personnel who credited the new training protocols with recognizing and developing their potential. Many of them were people who had been overlooked, dismissed, or harassed under the old system, but had become highly effective operators once their true capabilities were properly identified. Major Jennifer Kim, who had been rejected from special operations training 3 times under the previous protocols, had become one of the military's most successful counterintelligence specialists after being reevaluated under Rachel's frameworks. Her recent commendation for preventing a major security breach included a personal note: "Thank you for creating a system that saw what others missed." Captain David Thompson, whose quiet analytical approach had been dismissed as weakness under the old evaluation methods, had led a team that successfully completed one of the most complex hostage rescue operations in recent history. His after-action report specifically credited training protocols that emphasized collaborative problem-solving over individual aggression. These success stories were replicated thousands of times across all branches of the military, representing personnel who were now serving effectively because Rachel's experience had taught the institution to look beyond surface appearances to identify true competence. The transformation had also influenced how the military addressed harassment and toxic leadership. Rachel's documentation of systematic bullying had provided undeniable evidence that such behavior was not only morally wrong but operationally counterproductive. Zero-tolerance policies were now enforced with the kind of systematic rigor that had previously been reserved for security violations. Lieutenant Colonel Rachel Stevens, who had been assigned to investigate and prevent harassment in special operations units, published an annual report that showed dramatic improvements in workplace culture and personnel retention. The Morgan incident, as Rachel's experience had become known in military circles, served as a constant reminder that toxic behavior would not be tolerated regardless of its justification or the perpetrator's rank. Rachel's work had also influenced civilian organizations seeking to improve their own personnel development strategies. Corporations, law enforcement agencies, emergency response organizations, and educational institutions had adapted her insights to create more inclusive and effective evaluation systems. The Harvard Business School had developed a case study based on Rachel's experience teaching future business leaders about the costs of organizational bias and the benefits of recognizing diverse forms of competence. The case was required reading in leadership development programs at universities around the world. As Rachel prepared to leave her office that evening, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from the harassment she'd endured at Fort Bragg to her current position as one of the military's most influential policy developers. The transformation hadn't been easy or immediate, but it had been comprehensive and permanent. The quiet woman who had been stripped of her uniform in front of hundreds of observers had become the architect of a new understanding of military excellence. Her presidential tattoo remained hidden beneath her uniform, but its meaning had spread throughout the military establishment and beyond, representing the principle that true strength often remained concealed until the moment it was needed most. Rachel's legacy would continue long after her own service ended. The principles she'd identified, the protocols she'd developed, and the cultural changes she'd initiated would influence military personnel development for generations to come. Her 3 days of systematic harassment had been transformed into decades of improved opportunities for personnel whose competence might not announce itself in traditional ways. The harassment had ended, but the healing it had produced continued to spread throughout the military establishment and beyond, ensuring that future generations of service members would be evaluated based on their actual capabilities rather than their conformity to outdated expectations. Rachel Morgan had proven that the most dangerous operatives were often the ones nobody saw coming, and the military was stronger for having learned that lesson. In her office at the Pentagon, Rachel placed a final signature on a training directive that would expand the Morgan Protocol to NATO allied forces. The document represented the culmination of 5 years of testing, refinement, and validation proof that her methods produced superior results across diverse military cultures. As she prepared to leave for the evening, a knock sounded at her door. Rachel looked up to see Robert Fisher, now retired from active duty, but serving as a senior civilian advisor to Special Operations Training. "Got time for a drink with an old soldier?" he asked with a smile. Minutes later, they sat in a quiet corner of the officers' club, 2 glasses of aged whiskey between them. Fisher raised his glass. "To the ones who stand in the shadows." Rachel nodded appreciatively. "And to those who recognize them when others don't." Fisher had been the first to see beyond her cover at Fort Bragg, the experienced eye that had noticed what everyone else had missed. His quiet intervention had possibly prevented the harassment from escalating to dangerous levels. "You know," Fisher said after a thoughtful sip, "Carson completed the retraining program." Rachel's eyebrow rose slightly. This was news. Melissa Carson had been the architect of her harassment, the officer who had ordered her to strip in front of her peers. "She's teaching at the academy now," Fisher continued. "Leadership ethics, actually. Specializes in bias recognition and personnel evaluation." Rachel's lips curled into a small smile. "The best teachers are often those who've made the worst mistakes." "She asks about you sometimes," Fisher said. "I think she'd like to apologize properly." Rachel considered this information. 5 years was a long time. People changed, grew, learned from their failures. She had built an entire system around the belief that people could develop beyond their initial limitations. "Maybe next time I'm at the academy," she said finally, "it might be educational for both of us." Fisher nodded, understanding the significance of the concession. Rachel Morgan didn't harbor grudges, but she didn't offer easy forgiveness either. If she was willing to meet with Carson, it represented a profound belief in the redemptive power of the system she had created. As they finished their drinks, Rachel's thoughts turned to the future. Her work was not complete, perhaps it never would be. There would always be institutional biases to overcome, hidden talent to recognize, systems to improve. But she had created something enduring, a legacy that would continue to shape the military long after she was gone. The next morning, Rachel stood before a classroom of new special operations candidates. The group was noticeably different from those she had trained with 5 years earlier, more diverse in age, gender, and background. Among them was a woman in her late 40s, a man missing 2 fingers on his left hand, and several individuals who wouldn't have fit the traditional image of elite operators. "Welcome to Advanced Assessment," Rachel began. Over the next 12 weeks, you will be evaluated not on how well you conform to expectations, but on how effectively you accomplish objectives. She paced slowly along the front of the classroom. Some of you have been told you don't belong here, that you're too old, too different, too unconventional. I'm here to tell you that those differences, properly channeled, can become your greatest operational assets. Rachel could see the skepticism in some faces, the cautious hope in others. They had all heard rumors about the Morgan Protocol, but few understood how fundamentally it had changed military culture. In this program, we don't care about how strong you look. We care about how effectively you think. We don't measure success by how much attention you draw to yourself, but by how invisibly you can accomplish your mission. We don't reward those who shout the loudest, but those who observe the most carefully. She paused, letting her words sink in. The most effective operators I've known were rarely the ones who dominated every room. They were the ones who could enter unnoticed, assist accurately, adapt instantly, and succeed consistently regardless of the obstacles placed in their path. Rachel's eyes moved across the room, connecting with each candidate. That is the standard to which you will be held. Not against each other, but against the mission requirements you will face in the field. Later that afternoon, Rachel met Fisher for their weekly coffee. The old sergeant major had become both friend and mentor, one of the few people with whom she could speak candidly about both past and future. "How was the new class?" he asked. "Promising," Rachel replied. "Different backgrounds, different perspectives, different strengths. Exactly what we need." Fisher nodded approvingly. The eagle that conceals its talons catches the most prey. Rachel smiled at the old proverb. It had become something of a motto for her program, a reminder that true power often lay in restraint, in careful observation and strategic patience. "To the eagles," Fisher said, raising his cup. "And to those wise enough to recognize them," Rachel replied, completing their ritual toast. Outside the window, the sun was setting over the Potomac, casting long shadows across the Pentagon grounds. Somewhere in those buildings, thousands of decisions were being made based on protocols. Rachel had designed systems, she had reformed principles she had identified through her own experience of adversity. The quiet woman who had once been ordered to strip before her peers had transformed that humiliation into institutional wisdom that would protect and empower generations of operators to come. The eagle had not just revealed its talons, it had changed the very definition of strength.